In the winter of 1874, a mute girl began to draw deaths before they happened. Each fire, each coffin, each face. She never spoke a word. Then one night, she drew herself. Do you believe some children can see what's coming? Have you ever felt something before it happened? Let me know in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if you don't want to miss what we uncover next, subscribe and hit the bell. Some stories come back when you least expect them to those of you who stop to listen. Thank you. Whether you came for one case or stayed for more, you're part of this now.
They called it Merriweather Ward, though no official record of such a ward exists in any public archive. It was said to be a special annex of the Vermont State Asylum for the Insane, hidden behind the trees on a snow-covered hill just outside Waterbury. The main asylum, opened in 1891, has records that trace back further to 1867, when the grounds were already used by the state for medical observation. That's what they called it. In truth, it was a dumping ground for the misunderstood, epileptics, the deaf, the traumatized, and children who didn't behave quite like children should. Merriweather was not a hospital. It was a building with no nameplate, 3 floors high, with gabled windows and blackened chimneys. It stood quiet, away from the patient's garden and visitors' quarters. Inside, a dozen children lived in near silence, supervised by women in gray uniforms, not nurses, not nuns, just staff, paid well, told little. In early January of 1874, a girl arrived. No records list her name, no birth certificate, no arrival form, just a note, typewritten, unusually, that read, Subject 778. -B, do not sedate. Monitor for predictive phenomena. Weekly submission required. She appeared to be around 9 years old, pale, wiry, dressed in a coat 2 sizes too small. She didn't speak, didn't eat for the first 2 days, just stared, wide-eyed, alert. She came with one item, a worn sketchbook wrapped in red twine. The girl didn't respond to her assigned name, Elsie. She didn't speak to staff, but she drew, and her drawings were far from ordinary. The first was the west hallway, precise, down to the crack in the window pane on the 3rd door. The second showed a staircase that hadn't existed since the east wing collapsed in 1871. Then came the portraits. Faces that matched no one in the ward, unblinking, dated, and always 1 page ahead of the calendar. January 28th, the asylum's coal boiler ruptured, burning a groundskeeper alive. February 3rd, a patient in the lower wing jumped from the 3rd floor landing. February 9th, Sister Marjorie fell through the frozen pond near the chapel. Each date matched the girl's earlier sketches. The ward administrator tried to confiscate the book, but a second appeared. Same leather, same red binding, as though she'd always had it. They brought in a psychiatrist from Montpellier. He lasted 3 nights. On the morning of his departure, he was found standing in the girls' room, whispering the same word over and over. Downstairs. The bureau arrived on March 1st. 2 men in civilian coats, though they wore military-issue boots beneath them. They carried with them federal papers stamped with a seal no one recognized. Department of Child Study, Division 7. They took over Merriweather that day, no questions permitted. All staff dismissed. By March 5th, the girl had stopped drawing altogether. She sat still for hours at a time, staring into the furnace as if waiting for something. On March 12th, at 2:17 a.m., the building's west wing burned to the ground. No cause of ignition was ever found. No remains of the girl were recovered. But 3 weeks later, during salvage, a carpenter uncovered a hidden crawl space behind the wall of room 12B. Inside was a single page, nailed to the wooden slats. It showed the Merriweather building engulfed in flame. The date, March 12th. Below it, a new sketch had begun. A modern room with clean white walls, fluorescent lights, and children seated at desks with no books. The sketch was unfinished, but one of the children looked out from the page, and her eyes were violet. March 2nd, 1874. The two men from the bureau did not introduce themselves. They did not speak to the children. They did not observe. They recorded. The taller one, gray-bearded, wore gloves even indoors, asked for blueprints of the building, though none existed. The other, younger, carried a leather case filled with brass instruments, unlabeled vials, and several pages of what looked like telegram transcripts. No sender, no recipient. They claimed authority under a directive from Washington, signed by the Department of Child Study, Division 7. But even the asylum's director, Dr. Edwin Shaw, admitted in private he'd never heard of such a department. No one had. The girl, still silent, was relocated to the lowest level of the West Wing. What had once been the surgical preparation room during the Civil War. No windows, stone floors, one iron cot, and a chalkboard mounted across from her bed. She wasn't restrained. But she never left the room. They gave her charcoal and a fresh ledger. Not to express herself, to replicate. The men would place a newspaper clipping or photograph in front of her and ask her to redraw it from memory. She would nod once, then recreate the image perfectly, down to the smallest tear or watermark. But then something changed. She began drawing images that weren't provided. Buildings not yet built. People in clothing that no one recognized. A flying carriage that hovered above streets lined with silver machines. She would add a date, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries ahead. March 11th. A child with no eyes, sitting in a room of glowing glass. August 9th, 1945. A city flattened beneath a mushroom-shaped cloud. February 3rd, 2026. A child alone in a white room, watched by a camera. Drawing fire. The men called it Violet Protocol. They had stopped referring to her by name. She was no longer Elsie. In their files, she was listed simply as Subject V. V for Violet, or for Variable. At night, other staff began to report symptoms. One sister experienced seizures for the first time in her life. A groundskeeper claimed he kept hearing a phonograph playing music from 50 years earlier, even though none were on site. A nurse, Miriam Rourke, was institutionalized herself after insisting she saw two versions of the girl, one still in the lower wing, and one walking the halls barefoot, humming the same 3 notes over and over. They sealed off Merriweather entirely on March 10th. Local deliveries were rerouted. All children moved to Montpelier. Dr. Shaw left in the night and never returned. And still, the girl kept drawing. The sketches now showed the same room, again and again. But the objects inside shifted, grew more modern. The cot became a steel bench, the chalkboard, a glowing wall. And then, finally, an empty chair in the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen faceless people in coats. And her, always her, but older, never aging, just changing. On March 12th, the lights went out across the Merriweather property. The fire that followed destroyed the entire wing. When the Bureau returned 2 days later, they searched the ruins, brick by brick. No trace of the girl was ever found. Only a final sketch, charred at the corners, nailed to the back of the iron cot in the cellar. It showed a girl standing in front of a camera, staring forward. The date beneath read, "Tonight." For decades, Merriweather was a name that faded like a half-remembered dream, or a deliberate omission. The Vermont State Archives, housed in Montpelier's red brick hall of records, made no mention of it in any official ledger. And yet, it existed. That's what Evelyn Parrish discovered on a rainy Thursday in March, exactly 151 years after the fire that erased it. She wasn't a historian, not formally. Just a graduate student with a soft obsession for missing persons cases from the 1800s, particularly those tied to state institutions. She hadn't been looking for anything extraordinary, but while reviewing a mislabeled box of hospital invoices from 1874, she found it. Case file number 778-B, filed under Deferred Child Observation/Division 7. The folder was sealed with a rusted clasp and smelled faintly of ozone. Inside, handwritten memos, several damaged sketches, and a typewritten protocol sheet. Across the top, the Merriweather Ward, subject fee, Violet Protocol, escalation phase 3. The sketches stunned her. Detailed images of machinery that hadn't existed in the 19th century, some of it still not invented. One depicted what looked like a sleek, windowless train. Another, a room filled with softly glowing white rectangles labeled screens. And in all of them, a girl with pale skin and violet eyes, unchanged across decades. Evelyn scanned the final page. Subject ceased aging after approximate age 9. Predictive cognition appears stable across all observational trials. Recommend indefinite containment. Pending outcome of phase 4. Subject is aware of observer presence. She didn't sleep that night, nor the next. She submitted the documents for preservation, but was quietly advised not to speak publicly. The file had been flagged with a Department of Defense marker, not standard for psychiatric history. And then, things started to go wrong. Her laptop screen would occasionally flicker, freeze on a black screen, and then return. Her email draft folders began filling with versions of her own writing, but rewritten in someone else's voice. She stopped dreaming. On the 7th night, she received a manila envelope at her door. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a photograph, yellowed and cracked, a black and white image of the Merriweather building before the fire. In one window, 2nd floor, west wing, a girl stood looking directly at the camera. One hand raised in a wave. On the back of the photo, in faded pencil, "You've opened it again." She knows. Evelyn returned to the archive, intending to leave the file behind. But when she opened box number 112 again, the contents had changed. No sketches, no memos. Just a single drawing, dated tomorrow, of a woman hunched over a desk, staring at a glowing screen. Behind her stood a girl, not aged, not older, exactly the same. And in the sketch, Evelyn's own name was written at the top, in neat, perfect script. Evelyn Parrish was not sleeping. Since the file was opened, her dreams had become fractured, rooms with no doors, violet glances in mirrors, a voice that whispered, "You're late." She hadn't told anyone, not her advisor, not her sister, not even the historian who'd warned her, half-jokingly, "Some archives don't want to be opened." But the sketch, the one showing her hunched over her desk, haunted her every time she opened her laptop. It was too accurate. The lamp, the mug, even the fray on her sweater sleeve. And now, there was a name. Buried deep in a report dated March 19th, 1874, 1 week after the fire at Merriweather, was a transfer order. A single patient had survived the blaze. He had no name, only initials, LB. Listed as undocumented adolescent, exhibiting spatial confusion and shared memory phenomena. He had been relocated to Brattleboro Retreat, another real psychiatric facility, still operational today. Evelyn drove there in the rain, heart hammering. Brattleboro looked like a museum of Victorian psychiatry. Red brick wards, iron railings, the scent of whetstone and old varnish. The administrator was reluctant at first, but Evelyn had the sketchbook, and that got her in. There, in a private wing with no roommates, sat an elderly man. Thin, pale, hands covered in age spots. But his eyes were sharp, flickering with something between memory and warning. When Evelyn said the word Merriweather, he closed his eyes. "She's not a girl," he said. "What is she?" Evelyn asked. The man, LB, didn't answer. Not right away. He reached into a box beside his chair and pulled out a page, yellowed, like parchment. It was a sketch. A hand-drawn replica of the one Evelyn had found. Only this one showed her standing by a door, hand on the knob, looking back over her shoulder. "How do you have this?" she whispered. He looked at her, hollow. "Because I dreamed it the night she left." Evelyn sat for hours as he told her what little he remembered, and what he could never forget. That the girl didn't walk. She moved like smoke. That rooms she entered would appear slightly different when she left. Windows taller, doors narrower, clocks stopped. That she would whisper words in languages he didn't know and yet understood. That she once stared at him for 20 minutes, then calmly said, "You won't die the same way twice." When the fire happened, he remembered nothing but waking in the trees outside, barefoot, and hearing, humming, a 3-note lullaby, over and over. He tried to leave the state once, got as far as Albany, and found himself waking in his room at Brattleboro, cold and shaking, the sheets covered in charcoal lines. "She's not gone," he said. "They didn't seal her away. They scattered her." "Where?" Evelyn asked. "Wherever someone looks too closely." That night, Evelyn returned to her flat in Montpelier. She found the sketchbook sitting on her bed. She hadn't brought it with her. The page was open to a new drawing. It showed her in bed, asleep, and something standing at the foot of the mattress. Not a girl, not a woman. A shape, outlined in violet ink, reaching, not toward her body, but toward her thoughts. The date was tomorrow. "They've officially closed the file. Not because it's over, but because it's easier that way. There won't be a press release, no public archive, no memorial plaque at the former site of Merriweather Ward in Waterbury, Vermont. Just overgrown hillside, cracked stone, and an iron fence that doesn't lock anymore." Evelyn Parrish vanished on April 2nd, 2026. Her flat in Montpelier was found exactly as she left it. Lights on, laptop still warm, cup of tea untouched by the window. Her sketchbook, not the original Merriweather one, but a modern one she'd used for university fieldwork, sat on the floor beside her bed. Open to the final page. The drawing was done in charcoal, soft lines and heavy shadows. It showed a child's bedroom, not Evelyn's, not Merriweather's, something more recent, modern. A girl sat on the edge of a narrow bed, head turned toward the closet. Someone was inside the closet. Only an eye was visible, open, watching. At the bottom of the page, written in small, neat lettering, "She comes through familiar places." Evelyn's fingerprints were found on every page. So were someone else's, a match the database didn't recognize. Smaller, like a child's. Security footage in her building froze between 3:12 a.m. and 3:18 a.m. Every frame after shows her apartment empty. The only sound logged during that blackout was a 3-note melody, soft, childlike, heard on audio from the floor below. When her colleagues were questioned, no one had seen Evelyn for 2 days prior. She'd stopped responding to emails, stopped attending classes. But someone had signed into her archive terminal using her ID 2 hours before the last sketch was drawn, and someone had used that login to access the sealed Merriweather files. Again, a week later, the Vermont Historical Society received an anonymous package. Inside, a photocopy of the original Violet Protocol report. A charred envelope marked D7 and a flash drive labeled only greater than she's still drawing. On the drive was a single image, a modern hallway, white-walled, sterile. At the far end stood a girl, facing the corner. You couldn't see her face, but her reflection in the glass caught her eyes, wide, pale, and unmistakably violet. Staff who handled the package have since reported vivid dreams. Others left without notice. The drive is now stored in a locked drawer at the Society, but the key has been missing since June. No one admits to moving it. The site of Merriweather Ward remains abandoned, though someone, or something, leaves sketches nailed to the fence every few weeks. They're always new, always dated tomorrow. Evelyn's body was never recovered, but her name has started appearing on archival search queries across multiple institutions, sometimes before anyone searches for her, sometimes in systems that aren't connected to the internet at all. No one opens the case anymore, not because it's solved, but because it's listening.